And when I started, okay, it says webinar is now being streamed live on YouTube, but it also says you're in a practice session. Which,
yeah. So if you click start webinar,
okay, all right. And I don't need to record that. Okay, great. All right, let's get started. Okay. All right. Okay, so I think we are live. So this is great. I know people are going to come in to the webinar as well. We have folks who registered and we're streaming live as well to YouTube. So I'm just going to begin. I'm going to open us up. My custom now, I begin in the name of Allah, for love of Muhammad, to honor the ancestors and in celebration of my people. Also, as a descendant of stolen people on stolen land, I begin acknowledgement that the land on which I am, right, is the unceded and ancestral territory of the indigenous peoples of North America. I also acknowledge the histories of colonialism, imperialism, and resistance that shape where I am and even where Dr. Wadud is, but that every day is Ashura and every land is Karbala. And I'm really excited tonight to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Amina Wadud about a new Hajar paradigm. Most of the folks who are, well, I'm sure many of the folks who are here tonight know who she is, so she doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do a quick introduction in terms of, I think, you know, Dr. Amina Wadud is an Islamic feminist. She's a progressive, she's a scholar, and she's the author of the really groundbreaking book, Quran and Woman. She also is the author of Inside the Gender Jihad. She's been a professor and has taught many different places. She's a part of Sisters in Islam, which we'll talk about today, that as a women's organization that was established in Malaysia. She also is known as AKA the Lady Imam, because she gave a historic khutbah in South Africa in 1984, and she also did a mixed gender khutbah service in New York City in 2005, where I actually was there. I don't know if you know that, but I was actually there. Yeah, I was there. You know, and she's just someone who I think has had a significant impact on many people's lives, including my own. And so I am really excited to welcome you tonight to talk about a new Hajar paradigm and to talk about how it fits into the work that I'm doing with Women's Archive. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm gonna pontificate a little bit to kind of get things started, and then we'll go. I'm gonna actually share my screen here. I have an image that I want to share. So, you know, so Women's Archive is a 6-part online exhibition that I've developed that is coming out of a larger project, Women's Archive, where I'm using the archive of my mother, Amina Matul Haq, she was born Orji Weeks, as a way to explore the meanings of being Black in the world. And lots of different topics are coming up from this. The first exhibition, we talked about World War II, right? In the second exhibition, we talked about kind of the conversion experience and so the activism of that generation as Muslims. And this exhibition is called Al-Mujaddila, Black Women in Love, in Heartbreak, and in Sisterhood. And what we're doing in this exhibition is what I'm really trying to do is deal with the kind of that part of a Black woman's life, right, through our mother's archive. And so when I'm in the archive and I'm looking through stuff, I find this cassette tape, which you see the photo here, right? Find this cassette tape from this talk, right, that you gave in 1998 at Columbia University. And I'm like, oh my, so first I have to find a cassette tape player so I can hear it, right? Because, you know, I don't have one, but I found one and I'm listening to it. And, you know, now at this point, I listened to it a couple times now. And I included it in this exhibition because it was important for me, particularly dealing with love and heartbreak and sisterhood, right? The ways that Black women, you know, we give a lot of love, we experience we don't always get it back. There's a lot of pain that's not always acknowledged. And so what you talked about in terms of the Hajar paradigm really resonated for me, right? And thinking about and thinking through what that meant and who Al-Mujaddila was and who Al-Mujaddila is, like in the lives of my mother and that generation and women today. And so this was the image. So I listened to the tapes, and I have to tell you, like, you know, I listened to it again most recently, right, when I was preparing this exhibition. And I think you may have said this to me too. You cover a lot of ground, But it's also like, it's also thrilling in a way, right? Because one of the things that I noticed, for example, when you open the conversation, you open with citations. So you kind of talk about, like you talked about Sister Leah and the people who kind of helped you think through the things that you were doing, right? So you talk about that. You also open, which I thought, particularly considering what's happening right now in Palestine, right? You open talking about, right, the way Hajar or Hagar, right, becomes used in the kind of interfaith conversation that can really kind of try to cover up, right, the injustices that are happening right now. And I'm like, 1998, Black Muslim woman professor, that's not easy. It's not easy to do in 2021, right? So I was also impressed by that. And then, of course, right, the talk itself, like the kind of background on Islamic history and Islamic law kind of history you give, and then digging deeply into who Hajar was and what she means particularly for sort of single women, right? Women who don't fit, whose lives don't fit into the ideal, right? So this is what, so I love listening to it again and again. And so I want to talk to you about that. I want to share one more thing before I do that. And then I found the program from the event. So super excited to find that as well. Because if you listen to the talk, the person who opens it, I wasn't there, but I can imagine, right? She's like this young college student and she's trying to figure it out, right? So that spirit is there too. So this is, and we'll come back to that. So I'm gonna stop the share now, but that's kind of just to give people a background. And so, and then in the exhibition itself, the talk has become much more significant. So it appears at least another time. So there's like the actual lecture that you gave, right? And then at one point in the lecture, you talk about Liz Taylor and she was married multiple times. And it's really questioning this kind of lifetime marriage framework and what that means. And, in the archive, there's lots of Oprah in the archive. And there's also an episode of Oprah where she talks about multiple marriage, right? And she brings up Liz Taylor. And so I did a montage to connect those. So it really has become a nice framing for the conversation. So I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to just ask you maybe if you can tell us, how did you end up at Columbia University on March 24th, 1998?
A'udhu billahi min shaitanir rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. It is such a thrilling honor to have an opportunity to talk with Dr. Suad. As I was saying to her earlier, this archive hopefully will set the standard for the way in which we affirm the struggles of our ancestors, even in the immediate generations, because your mother and I are peers. We knew each other, we hung out. You were little, and definitely, I'm sorry to say, not on my radar until you entered into the university. I listened to this recording again myself this morning because I finally was able to get access. Don't ask about my technology, but I had listened to it when you shared it with me, before the pandemic, and then I lost it. So I listened to it again, and in the background, I can hear your mom saying, mm-hmm. I thought, yes, there's an affirmation because not only do we share a name, although in Arabic it's slightly different, we also share the experience of maintaining our faith and our belief, despite the fact that we also were not maintained in the patriarchal, quote unquote, ideal family structure. So this lecture is the result of a series of events, which is always what happens in my life. 1993, I believe it was, the UN dedicated the year as the Year of the Family. I had recently returned to the United States from 3 years in Malaysia, teaching at the International Islamic University and being one of 8 founding members of Sisters in Islam, which I'll let us get to again later. And so we were very sensitive to the ease with which the word family was thrown out there without a critical and intersectional interrogation of whose family was going to be centered. Of course, we found the family that was going to be centered was the nuclear family. So I talk a great deal about the challenges and limits of the nuclear family particularly to springboard into, well, what happens when everything, systemically is aligned towards that model, which is already problematic, when the male member of that family somehow is no longer present. So about single female heads of household. At the time, I was also living that experience, having initiated my second divorce, and I was the mother of 5 children. I am the mother of 5 children, which coincidentally, I always include this in my professional vitas. People think somehow your only allocation has to do with how many degrees you have, books you wrote, or positions that you have maintained in the patriarchal workforce. But the reality is parenting 5 children, let alone parenting them as a single, is the most formidable task. So I had a very personal connection to the UN launching of the Year of the Family, and that led me to examine how we address our sort of historical female legacies. There was a really huge, couple hundred women gathered in one of the islands in some retreat center in New York as the daughters of Sarah and Hagar. And this included Muslim, Christian, and Jewish women intentionally in order to forge a sort of an interfaith conversation centered on gender and family and such ideas. But of course, it still maintained the Judeo-Christian priority by naming Hajar Hagar. That's the way that it appears in those sacred texts. And so I had all of these things come together that initiated an independent research into the life of Hajar and the way in which certain tropes, in my mind, are erased, made invisible. And to challenge those, I wanted to sort of bring her out of the margins. And I had a very personal alignment with her story in many ways. And these have increased over the years. The most recent khutbah that I gave was an online khutbah in which I talked about the construction of sacred stories in the context of Islam and Muslims, and how when we get to Eid al-Adha, it's only the story of the men that seems to matter. And yet there is this amazing historical figure around which the Muslim Hajj is centered, like almost literally, other than the Kaaba, the most central thing is Safa and Marwa. And yet she continues to be erased, made invisible, undermined, and she does not get to be the narrator of her own story. And one of the things that I had in mind was, it's sort of like you, Dr. Suad, what happens if you have a daughter who is conscious? And when your legacy goes forward, you make sure that that legacy respects the details of the struggle and the joys, but from the perspective of the woman. And so I, have scripted some other ideas about how we take this story forward, with regard to Hajar. And that all began, if I presented that many details in 1998, I did not walk into that event at Columbia with just the night before pulling together notes, which is what I do now in my old age. So I put a lot of time into it and created a paper. Coincidentally, that also became a central chapter in my second book, Inside the Gender Jihad. And also did a number of other presentations at professional groups and at other universities. But it just so happens that in 1998, I was doing a visiting researcher professorship at Harvard University in the Divinity School. And the main focus of my proposal was to look at the ways in which Muslim family is constructed in the law and the consequences of its, let me be frank, patriarchal privileging, given which is also quite detailed in that presentation, given the lived realities of Muslim women today. That was 1998. I accepted invitations from other institutions and from grassroots organizations, even while having to struggle simultaneously to provide childcare for my children when I went away. I accepted these because I considered myself part of the discourse. I, am Muslim by choice, and not only that, I choose to shape my Islam around what I see is the potential for me to have the most confirmed affirmation of my relationship with Allah, because I'm interested not only in this life, but the afterlife. So I take to task whenever there are matters that come across, my plate, and they just don't resonate. I take to task those things. I go back into the classical text, and I go into the discourses across history to see what were the ways in which this has been perceived over 14 centuries. And then when there is not yet enough of an affirmation of my reality, I began to contribute to the construction of knowledge by shaping, like what I call new paradigms, and or simply by raising challenges to the blind spots that have predominated.
Yeah.
So that's how I got there.
Yeah, no, I think you said you heard my mother go, mm-hmm. So I wondered, do you remember how you guys met?
Okay, so New York has always been, in terms of the African-American Muslim experience, New York has always been one of the leading places. And I went to undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania. So it's like a 2.5 hour or an hour and a half drive or something like that. Not that I had a car, but the thing is that there was some cross-fertilization, particularly amongst African-American Muslim women. Now, 1998, we had already started an initiative, which I also speak about in Inside the Gender Jihad, and that is what we would call the retreat, the Sisters Retreat. Now, these are amazing events because they are completely women-led, they're completely women-organized, and it demonstrated the ways in which African-American Muslim women in particular, because we were the ones that spearheaded sisters retreats and the like, how they organized around their own well-being. And these spread, New York, Atlanta, Philadelphia, even in Richmond where I was living, Boston, and networks would form between these women. And some of them started off rather, ad hoc, where you just, I would come into town for an event, but the ones inviting me would be other, African-American Muslim women who were spearheading these initiatives in the 1990s. I think a little bit in the late 1980s as well, but it really kicked off in the 1990s. So there had been many opportunities for me to interface, especially with Sister Alia, because she was a visionary and had been engaged in organizing before even this trend took root, across, especially across the Eastern Seaboard and eventually the West. No offense, I live in California officially, but we were a little bit late to the game. So New York was one of the centers and had been one of the centers for the movement of Black Islam from the time, obviously, of Malcolm. However, the gist of the ways in which Muslim women themselves took agency in formulating those events, and eventually also having the power to be able to wed their efforts with the larger male-dominated efforts until they also were recognized as leaders in their own right. So that was an exciting time because everyone that I met, they were in it for the long haul. And they persevered in love and joy. They were creative. Just the whole idea of centering on wellness, and that wellness is both internal and external was, just as amazing. And I did a lot of these. I attended them. Whatever was the topic that will come up, if it aligned with things I was interested in, I would address it. And they were really an exciting part of my life at that time.
Yeah. And so I think, I want to ask you maybe to talk. Well, I forgot to mention the T-shirt. I was looking at myself. I'm like, yeah, the T-shirt. You have your T-shirt, right? Yeah. And so, so let's talk about Hajar, right? Let's talk about Hajar, right? Because I was like, I gotta wear the T-shirt because, in fact, like, so the T-shirt, for those who don't know, it comes from a poem that I wrote. And this is like a phrase from the poem, and it was a fundraiser for Sapelo Square, which is an online resource on Black Muslims in the United States that I helped to lead. And but my Hajar is so meaningful. Like, as a Black woman, right? As a Black woman who was raised by a single Black woman, right, and raised Muslim, like, her story has always resonated. And I think what you talk about really resonates, right, because you make those connections. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about, like, what is the Hajar? What is a new Hajar paradigm? Or, maybe what it was then and if it's changed a little now, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question because having been engaged with it for, at least a quarter of a century myself, I think it is continuing to evolve and continuing to challenge us and to evoke new possibilities with regard to how we look at our Islamic legacy. Like, if somebody is, again, were to create, the Umi archive for Hajar, what would it look like? And you have to remember that the Sa'i, the running between Safa and Marwa as a central or required event for the performance of the Hajj and even for Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage, is centered on literally her experience. And yet, whenever we get back to Eid al-Adha, the second major Eid, the focus is so much on Abraham and Ismail that, Ishaq disappears, Sarah disappears, Hajar disappears, and yet she had a most interesting experience. Now, I continue to work on it, and the recent khutbah, which is somewhere out there on YouTube. You can follow it on my channel, The Lady Imam, if you like.
We'll try to add a link here too. We can add a link in the chat. So, yeah.
Good. The consideration of exactly who is this character has continued to interest me, because the story that is confirmed by both Jewish, Christian, and Islamic, I was going to say Judeo-Christian, but let's keep them also distinct. The story that is confirmed is that Sarah was not able to reproduce, and we live in a world where physical reproduction is really important, and it's importance to men that makes it important. So that household did not have a male heir. And so the Quranic story is like much more exciting, because eventually Allah, who has the power to create from nothing, also corrects her reproductive situation there. So she does have a child, but before that, she avails herself of a system which was quite common at that time and continued to be for centuries. And that is, a prominent male in the community would be given a surrogate, a woman to bear his child, and that child would become the heir to the household, and the household would still be the household of the primary couple. So that would be Ibrahim and Sarah. And so that means that Hajar had to be a slave. And I also have interrogated the reality of, if you are going to take a slave for the purpose of surrogacy, what does that mean? In all possibility, she was also probably a child. In other words, in her fertile years, at a time when there was no such thing as, the minimum age, for marriage, she was probably a young pubescent girl, and therefore she was unfamiliar, I'm assuming, with the world of sex and sexuality. So that means she enters into a primary relationship, and she is not consenting. In other words, as a slave, she has no choice, just like our ancestors. So my ancestry in enslaved peoples from Africa is very much focused on women who were enslaved. And if you think that as many as a third of those enslaved in North America, especially in the United States, were from Muslim background, what happens to an African Muslim woman at that time when she is brought to the auction block and her option to observe certain kinds of bodily decorum is stripped literally. So this, this is the DNA of my, my entire existence. So if I think about, a young girl put into a household, I know all of the divine story. I'm a theologian. It's not like I ignore it, but the reality is Allah's success in achieving Islam, that is the deen of truth, the way of life that affirms life, this one and the after one, can only operate through what we call now lived realities. So I kind of like fluff out a bit the reality of what this must have been for her and what does it mean that she participates in it. And because of it, according to Islamic law, even as a slave, her child is free and inherits from the father, whether male or female, and she cannot become the slave of any other person upon the death of the main patriarch. She is also supposed to be free, and so she has a future because she applied herself to this system. And yet, before we get there, she is literally walked into the desert with a nursing baby and abandoned.
There's something,
And that,
there's some kind of background noise.
yeah, unfortunately, my neighbor's
Oh, okay.
going out with his motorbike.
Okay, no, that's fine. I thought it was something else, but that's perfect. So okay, so I'm sorry, I interrupted you. So now she's abandoned. She's in the desert. You were saying, right?
Yeah. So there's two layers to this. One is the entire understanding of concubinage, which, with no way you whitewash this with regard to different ways of understanding marriage, which is what some people have done. Let's just look at the reality. How does a woman go into a group of people and bring one of those people to the service of her household, except through slavery? And then what does that mean about consent? And, what does that mean about her reproductive years? I mean, you're not going to bring in a mother of 4 kids just because she's proved her fertility, because there's going to be some conflict, So, I mean, that, we have to, fluff out all these details. However, that's not the end of the story. The story continues to another event, and that is the event that is celebrated for the pilgrimage, for the Hajj. And we are told that when the little bit of the flask of water that she has, or whatever you call the skin that's holding the water, when it is gone, there's this baby who he's nursing, but he also is hydrated by regular water. That's what we do, right? And she's not hydrated, and so she runs back and forth between these two foothills. Now, it just so happened that in 2012, I made the Hajj. And I was already in my 60s, literally 60, come think of it. When you get to this place, and now it's like beautiful, white, tiled, air conditioned, the going in one direction is marked, the going in the other direction is marked, and in between there's actually a passageway for people with different abilities to be pushed in wheelchairs. It's completely convenient for our realities today, almost causing us again to make invisible what it was like for Hajar. For me, because I was older, I started walking, in the park in my neighborhood to build up my capacity to do the 7 units on my own 2 feet. I wanted to be stronger. And so I had the distance measured, and then I multiplied it times 7, and I have to be able to walk a little marathon. And when you're doing it, there's a sign. It's LED. The sign lights up. And at this place is where she ran, because she's walking along, she's looking, and she gets frantic, and then she runs. And right below it is a new sign that says running is prohibited for women.
I remember that.
And I wanted to defy it, but trust me, I was just getting my body to the place where I could do the walking on my own. The running was just not going to happen. So in my heart, I ran. And so we are dealing with this contradiction between the reality for her, hot, dry, abandoned, literally running, and then the institutions of patriarchy that control not only our notions of Islam, but our experiences of Islam when we go for this major once-in-a-lifetime ritual telling us we are not worthy to participate in that way.
Yeah.
So that also spurred some new writing on my part. So there are aspects of her story which I find, really moving, and there are aspects of the way that story is cast, which I find really troubling. And so most of where I have been working on this paradigm has been in a relationship between the dominant sort of patriarchal expression that presumes, because she believes in God and because she and Ismail also surrendered to God, that somehow we cannot question exactly what was going on there and what the implications are.
Yeah. It's funny. I made Hajj with my mother actually in 2001, and I remember that and I didn't know. I'm ready to get my because I was younger, so I'm ready to get my speed on. And I ran or jogged because it's a long distance. It's not like
a long distance.
So I jogged, and then people were definitely like, "No, you can't do that." And I'm like, "But a woman did this. Like the reason why we're doing this is a woman did this. So why would I, of all kinds of people, not be able to do that?" Like I remember that. And I think what's I found so compelling about the work you do in general, but also the new Hajar Paradigm, is forcing us to confront the inconsistencies. Like I listened this morning, I listened to that khutbah you mentioned, and I was struck. So the thing is, like in the talk in '98, you make this point that because we promote this idea of a nuclear family, right, as an Islamic ideal, which is not even like the practice of Muslims over time, right? Then we, as a community, we shirk our responsibility towards those families that don't meet that ideal, right? And so you get left out in the cold, right? And so you have your own. You're not on the plains of Safa Marwa, but you're like, I don't know, in a project in Brooklyn, or something like that, and you're on your own trying to figure out how to do this, right, without support, and that inconsistency. And then in your talk that I listened to from last year, you were making this point, which I thought was really profound, was thinking about what does our understanding of this have to say about our understanding of who Allah is, right? Like who we think Allah is, right? And I never really thought about it that way before, how do we tell this story? So there's the reality of needing to respond to the needs of all different kinds of families, right? And having our tradition be flexible enough to do that. But then there's also this kind of other level of like, well, what does how we narrate these things say about what we think about Allah, right? And that was really striking to me from your.
Yeah, I'm a theologian bequeathed to me by my father, the Methodist minister. So I'm always thinking about notions, of the divine. Right now I'm working on the divine feminine because of the Jamal attributes of Allah that I feel are also undermined because of a concentration on the Jalal or masculine attributes of Allah. And yet, Allah has both. And with this event, one of the things that I really challenge people to do when the community story makes her invisible and makes her struggle seamless is to think about why it is that we pretend that, Allah is the wise, Al-Hakim, and therefore we can't say anything about anything that happens. And this is a problem for faith, because if you are a faithful person and you are focused, as I am, on Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the compassion, the mercy, and the grace, if you are focused on this kind of thing will jar your complacency unless you just ignore it. And the problem with ignoring it is that it creates an internal kind of hypocrisy, a kind of lie. So I'm not afraid to take these stories and to delve into what the implications are. Right now, I'm working on the Lute story, which has some really interesting implications. By engaging in it, yes, it is a challenge to my faith, but I'm a person who believes in El Hay. I believe in the living God. And therefore, if I, as a temporarily living being, cannot have a true relationship with Allah, then basically Allah does not fulfill the trajectory that we are given with the Quran. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. This is the book in which there is no doubt guidance for those who have consciousness, God consciousness, taqwa. And therefore, to me, it's a natural extension to think about the theological implications. Sometimes people try to castigate me because it's like, well, that's what Allah, that was what Allah decreed, And I'm like, we are Khalifatullah, we're agents of Allah. Again, that means we have to be in an active relationship. The place where we activate that relationship, inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I'm creating a khalifa on the earth, that is in this dunya. When we are raised with the DNA of American enslavement of African peoples, we cannot afford to ignore the ways in which race, class, gender, sexuality, and the like play out for the ways stories are dominated, pretending that that version is the only version that we must believe in order to be true believers. In order to be true believers, we have to break through our own lies and hypocrisy. So it was easy for me because I was already entering into my second phase as a single parent. It was easy for me to take this story up in that way, but also mercifully, because I was back in the US, but I was still a member of Sisters in Islam. And eventually, Sisters in Islam will become the springboard for the launching of Musawa. And Musawa is a global movement for reform in Muslim family law. So that was also sort of the background of where I was going. You have to think not only what do we mean by family, what is the relationship of this family model to the well-being of each of the members, as well as how the law, state policy, and the culture supports certain paradigms that are not beneficial to all those members, parents and children, extended family as well, that are not equally beneficial to all of those members. And then they put this stamp on it. Well, that's Islam, sister, you can't do anything about it. It's like, no, I don't believe in that kind of Islam.
I'm gonna share.
I'm a Khalifa.
I'm gonna share these two. So these two. Can you see them?
It's coming in.
Let's see.
It takes a minute always because the technology has to go through so
I
many
don't know why I
clicks.
can't see them all of a sudden, but
It says has
let me stop.
Has started sharing. That means no
Right.
patience, sister. You have to be patient.
No, but I actually think it might be. Oh, here it is. Hold on a second. Let me get this together. Sorry, y'all. It was in full screen, and that's why you couldn't see it. But let me do this again.
That's right. That happens. I have two screens, so I can see it on another screen and still see you.
I want to share these two. So in this exhibition at Mujadila, these two booklets are also in the exhibition. They were in my mother's collection in her library, right? They're from Sisters in Islam. And I know you had a role to play, right? Well, both of her getting them, and then, but also in the contents, right, of these. Can you share a little bit about that? And if there are questions from the audience, let us know.
I'm sorry, say that again. And
I'm just telling the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the
Yes.
Q&A.
Okay. So Allah is so merciful, and I've had so much, blessing in my life. It just so happens that when I finished my PhD in the United States, I could not get a job because I was hijabi. Let me be frank. I had enough indications that that was the issue, that, I don't need to go over it again, because what happened instead is I accepted a position excuse me, at the International Islamic University in Malaysia that was just, sort of ramping up its sort of institutionalism. And I arrived in August 1989. And I had a 6-week-old baby with me, so my kids were there with me. And in September of the same year, that is 1 month later, I began meeting with a group of women who finally, brought all of the work they'd been doing for the previous 2 years together to register themselves as CIS Forum legally, because you can't have the word Islam in your name, but they continue to be recognized as Sisters in Islam. And over the next 3 years, we met every week. And the projects that we took on was to compete with the public voice of Islam, to challenge some of the, the major tropes that were being projected in the public space as, the voice of Islam. And we also took up issues like multiple wives and domestic violence. And the reason we took up domestic violence is very specific, and that is that Malaysia signed an anti-domestic violence bill into law. And then they said it cannot apply to Muslims. Now, Malaysia is like 50-60% Muslim, so they've got another, 35-40% that are not Muslim, and they, as citizens, would get the full rights of this bill, but Muslims could not. Yeah. And so one of the questions was, are Muslim men allowed to beat their wives? And we took this project up. We broke up into 2 groups. One worked on the equality book, and one worked on the domestic violence booklet. And we then raised funds to, reproduce thousands of copies, to give these out free or for just a little, token amount. And I had a bunch of them because I continued to go back and forth to Malaysia even after I left in 1992. And I used to give them out at all the public talks that I gave until there were no more. These are the original colors, 2 shades of purple, because we thought that was a nice, cozy, feminist color. Now they're like even more elaborate, and they have, arabesque and tessellation and all that kind of stuff, because we continue to reproduce them. But it was our first attempt to provide, especially for women, accessible information regarding the challenge to the patriarchal tropes of Islam. So it was made in a question and answer form, which made the information, more accessible. As you can see, I don't have any problem talking, and that talk alone, with the speed that I was speaking, indicates that I can put a lot in a few minutes. And so what I did contribute to this was looking at the theological projections from the Quran with regard to the issues of domestic violence and gender equality.
Yeah. So we don't have questions yet, but of course I have questions, so it's not a problem. I have a comment / question, I guess. When I was listening to the lecture again, I was just thinking about the loss for my community, for Black Muslim communities, of you. Like, I was thinking about, like, I've known who you were, like, I've followed, I've read, right? But there have been people have been, you're asking us to challenge ourselves, right? In terms of what you're thinking about. And, I feel like the response to that is like, well, no, we don't want to be challenged. So this one, I don't know what she's talking about, we're going to leave her alone. But I feel like there's something really expansive. And it's not because, like, you have to agree with everything that your perspectives, but even, like, thinking about Umi's archive, it's like, my mother is not here in the flesh. There are certain things I have to imagine. What do I think was happening? I don't really know. I mean, I have some evidence, so it's not completely just, out of the air, but I'm taking the evidence and I'm imagining what I think happened, right? Because I want to understand what her experience was, because it informs my experience. And like what I say about the archive is a reclaimed space where we remember and dream, right? So we have to know where we came from in order to get place forward, right? And so there's a process of like interrogation and investigation and imagination, right? And even in this exhibit, I was telling Angelica, the village auntie from the live, this was the hardest exhibit for me to curate, because I really wanted to do justice to the heartbreak that she experienced in her life. And I know that that's not something we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to talk about that. And so I wanted to acknowledge for myself that I feel like I'm like, who might we have been as a community in the years, since I first met you, right? If there was a deeper engagement in what you're saying as opposed to a shunning. And I wanted to know if you might just talk about what the challenges you face, being a Black, Muslim woman, kind of sharing these kinds of ideas, right? Like, what has that been like for you?
Thank you for asking, especially thank you for asking in a public space. It is one of the aspects of my life that often brings me a certain amount of sadness, and that is that I don't have the opportunities to serve in my particular community as an African-American woman who converted, in the 1970s, to serve in that community as much as I did, coming up to the 90s. I was, still invited to things. Now I'm no longer invited. However, because the experience in Malaysia in 1992 kickstarted my international, I call it consultancy now for legal purposes, because that happened then, I've been really busy. Not only have I been really busy, but I retired from US academia in 2006. So we're talking 15 years, and I've been really busy. And I now get to do that which I love the most. And as a consequence, while it does make me sad that, I'm not as involved with the African-American community as I would like to be, I am really busy. So, and I'm busy in a very blessed way, because, for example, I have migrated to Indonesia as my place of residence. I've taken a residency, and I consider this my retirement. I'm on a tropical island. I mean, what's not to love? But I came to the National Islamic University in Yogyakarta, as well as Gajah Mada University and the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, to propose to teach a single course on methodology of reading for gender and sexuality in Islamic sacred texts. And they were like, please, can we hire you? So now I'm back in academia. So I have a very loving response to my work in certain quarters, like Indonesia. Obviously, it's not for everybody. I know that I am way on the left. And so far, to me, what it means is that I have a whole different perspective on what is center. But I understand that that our African-American Muslim community is really conservative. It doesn't mean that everyone is, and also because I'm hoping that the generations next are, as is being reflected by Muslim youth, I think globally, it's like they're not buying into those stories that way. So it may change. Hopefully, if it does change, it won't flood me with too much, because, I am, looking towards my 70s in a minute. But I continue to make contributions that I hope will be intersectional, decolonial, inclusive. And as I said, I have come to the age now where if it appears to me to be too dark, then I need to turn around and once again face the light, because darkness is only because you're standing and you're looking in the shadow. I don't look in the shadow. I mean, I put light on the shadow so that, we go forward. And so as a consequence, Allah has given me some amazing opportunities. I work with amazing people. I have a series called Friends Along the Way because I wanted to showcase the people that I worked with. I hope you will join me at some point, please.
Yes.
Just, like amazing people doing amazing things. And as a consequence, my love for Islam only grows. I don't have, like any kind of bitter, anything. I would have loved for it to also be something that I could offer. And at many times I've tried new efforts in the context of my own community, the African-American Muslim community, but you can't force it. Just like you don't force people to follow you in prayer if they're not ready for the idea of the lady as imam. It's not something you force on people, but you cannot stop and take the opportunities that Allah gives to you to advance your own experience in Islam amongst Muslims as part of history, remembering and creating. You have to not only remember those stories, but you also have to shape those stories in alignment with the creativity that you need to do in order to go forward. So again, what you're doing with Umi Archives is not just, capturing her history and her experience, bringing it out of the darkness, but you're also, by putting the light on it, providing a guidepost for others in the future to understand that, women in that generation, we had so much tenacity, but we also had spirit.
Yes.
And it sustained us when the community pretended that everything was okay because Islam is perfect. I do believe Islam is perfect. I just think Muslims are imperfect. I'm imperfect,
Right.
So there was something about, the kind of legacy, that your mom bequeathed to you, because she did not lose her love for Islam. She did not lose faith. She did not lose hope.
Right.
And yet, if you look at it, what she was granted by way of the community was not nearly in alignment with the beauty that she offered to the community itself.
Yeah.
So again, you are to be commended.
Oh, thank you. No, definitely. I mean, I feel like you, and talking to you reminds me too, like, her and your generation, like, and we were talking earlier, you were like, there were some amazing people. You were like, I won't say I'm amazing. I'm like, but no, you are. Like, it really is. I mean, like, it's like building new worlds, and this kind of, and yes, and tenacious and moving and forward, and like, and even like some of the other things in this exhibition, like there's this one exhibition that the one piece, right, where it's a Muslim sister who was a friend of my mother's, whose husband has abandoned her, and she writes basically almost like a treatise, and she's like, this is what happened, this is what the Islam says. She's looking for a community kind of restorative way to kind of resolve the issue. I mean, these are not people who don't know their religion. These are not people who are not invested in their religion. These are not people who like are shy to sort of, this is, it's like, and so wherever so I feel like something really significant about that. And I think that being Black and Muslim and women and female at the time that you were, I think all of that created that. So we're about to run out of time, and there are two questions here. So I'm going to ask the first question, and maybe we get the second. We close out with the second question. Okay, so wait, there are three questions. Okay, sorry, there are three questions. Okay, so we're going to see. Let's see. Okay, well, I'm going to go with the first one, and then I'll try to put the other two together. So the first one is from Dr. Shabana Mir. She says, I really value the historical record we are discussing here. I value the progress of thought and how we have grown. I have come to conclusions vis-a-vis Islam that are quite different from my past conclusions. When you think of your present-day conclusions, re-Islam and women, do you think of them as being present in your mind in germinal form in the past, or something else?
As I said, thank you for the question, Dr. Shabana. I love you too. I have consciously tried to promote, especially in the public space, since I do, have quite a public, arena. I've constantly tried to promote the notion of Islam and Allah as al-Hayy, as living. And living means changing. So the skin cells on your body, every 6 weeks, they're a complete new set of skin cells, right? So the rejuvenating power of an initial idea or experience, to me, is what makes life, interesting. So I do continue to try to live fully in the challenges and the ideas, to the point where I go back into our intellectual and spiritual legacy to re-examine and rethink, posit certain ideas, some of them tenuous, some of them take up, some of them don't take up, and that's the way that I have exchanged with Islam from the beginning, because I was very Salafi when I first embraced Islam, and I voluntarily chose to cover my face for 4 years. I mean, I thought that was Islam, and now I realize, oh, that is one possibility, but there's so many other possibilities, and I have to find my trajectory. I have to find the way in which I can authentically relate to Allah, and through that relationship fulfill what is my purpose, on the earth.
So the combination last question is a question from Dr. Amina Al-Din and a Moira Smith. I'm going to put them together. So Dr. Al-Din says, isn't the overwhelming hegemony of male interpretation and the continuing promotion of some women of gender denigrating tropes, which is related to the next question, which is basically asking, could you talk about the importance of Muslim women questioning the patriarchy in Islam, especially in regard to the interpretation of Quranic texts?
Yeah, well, that's only my whole life. So I will have to tell it in an anecdotal way. When I became Muslim, it's actually because I went to the mosque and I was already covered. And I took up the Shahada and began to, just do more reading. And eventually, literally 5 months later, I was given a copy of the Quran and I fell in love. And that was with a translation that today I cannot even stand to read. But I dedicated myself to unraveling the mystery of this text. And it took me all over the world. I mean, literally. And in the process, I simultaneously, in graduate school was learning hermeneutics. And that is the idea that nobody just picks up a text and reads it, or nobody just writes a text, but in this case, we know it's a revelation, but except that they do so from their own intellectual, spiritual, and embodied location. So how might a slave in Alabama read a certain story? I'm making a lot of imagination here because the permission to read wasn't necessarily widespread, but how might they read a story or hear a story regarding, say the prophet Moses? Well, it might be a woman who makes herself, Harriet Tubman, into the Moses of freeing Black people from slavery. So the shaping of the human experience is an interaction with knowledge production. And Islam is very heavy on the ideas of knowledge production. And yet, when you look at the history of tafsir, that is Quranic, interpretation, we go all the way until the 19th century without a record of women's voices. And it occurs to me, might be some other aspects to these stories that we can get. And that's really where I started. And that's still where I'm going with regard to it. And that is to fulfill the guidance. We need as many voices to participate in it as possible. And so every generation, every location, be this in terms of your own, race, ethnicity, sexuality, all of these become a part of the story. And that's been the blessing of my life, to be a part of that.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, there's something so generative and expansive and deeply faithful, right, about how you're talking about these things, about how you engage these things, that I think is really inspiring. I think it represents your generation. I think it also represents a model, right, that we can sort of pick up, right, and continue that legacy in terms of this idea of, if God is a high, right, then Islam is also living, right, and that we should never, I always joke, people get mad, for example, when we have the moon wars, Ramadan time, right, but I always feel like I'm not mad at that, because at least people are engaging their religion, right, at least they care enough to be like, we want to know when this is happening. And so I think that's a great especially since Umi's archive is for a woman who is not with us in the flesh, right? So she is passed on, but the life and the legacy doesn't end, right? And it continues on. So I think that is a great note for us to end on. We had one person say, thank you so much. I forget. Oh, anyway, someone said thanks. Something you said was beautiful. So someone said thank you for that. It was beautiful. But thank you so much for joining me today and being a part of this conversation. And, I encourage people to, we will check out the Eid Khutbah. You can Google it. It's like Eid Khutbah 2020, or on her Instagram or Facebook, or Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, because even though you're like I'm older, but you're like really active on social media. And when she posts that, as well as, check out Umi's archive. You can hear the entire lecture there. We also have a transcript of it as well. And then other pieces, both the pamphlets of Sister in Islam and other pieces of the archive and the exhibition that are related to this question, right, of Black women in love, in heartbreak, and in sisterhood. And with that, I want to wish everybody a wonderful evening. Good night, peace, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you again.